Hello everyone! Welcome to Chapter 4. Chapter 4 deals with language and meaning, helping minds meet. This chapter will provide us with an understanding of the extreme importance of language and give us a reminder that we need to be conscious and careful about the types of language that we use so that it's appropriate and culturally sensitive. So let's get started. This chapter will define language and explain the triangle of meaning. We will also explain the factors that play into the communication of meaning between people. We will identify certain problems that relate to effectively creating meaning, including different patterns of miscommunication that can take place. We will also discuss the relationship between culture and language. We will also discuss the relationship between powerful speech and perceptions of credibility, and we will address the importance of learning how to speak in a powerful manner with the absence of powerful speech markers so that we can be effective in our communication. We will also address the issue of how power and incivility can affect language use, and we will address the negative impact of incivil language use in society. We will also analyze how technology influences language use, communication, and our relationships. And finally, we will discuss various techniques that we can use to improve our language and our communication skills. So let's get started. When we look at the process of language use, we can see that language is a unified system of symbols or words that allow for us to share meaning with each other. Now, there are lots of different languages in the world, and even among the same languages, we have lots of different words or ways of talking about things that can give meaning to the interactions that we have with people. So we want to think about words as symbols that are used to represent something else. What's important about this is that meanings are in people, not in words. So sometimes when we assume that the same words we're using mean the same thing to another person, we can run into some problems with potential miscommunications. Also, we want to make sure that the language that we use is culturally sensitive and politically correct so that we don't unintentionally offend people by using symbols or words that to us are okay, but to other people perhaps it represents something that's negative. We can look at the triangle of meaning, which is a model that explains the relationship that exists between words, things, and thoughts. The model allows us to understand how words are fairly ambiguous and that things and words are not inherently connected. So we're going to look at this model on the next slide, and we'll talk in more detail about it then. The triangle of meaning, figure 4.1, is depicted here. The triangle of meaning was developed by two communication theorists, C.K. Ogden and I.A. Richards. And they developed this model in order to help us better understand the way that language works. According to the model, there are 3 points in the creation of meaning that takes place through communication. At the top, you see a person's thought. At the bottom on the left, you see the word that the person chooses to use to represent the thought. And then the broken line connecting the word and the thing indicates that sometimes the words that we use do not always accurately address that thing that we are trying to refer to in another person's mind. So what this suggests is that we always need to be reminding ourselves that the only relationship that exists between the words we use and the things that they represent are actually the images and ideas that exist in people's minds. What this means is that in order to be a successful communicator, we should understand the relationship that does exist between people's thoughts and their reactions and the words that we might use. This is why it is especially important to use effective language when we are communicating with people. Using language effectively will allow us to be much more successful in our personal and professional communication interactions, and we're going to get into various ways that we can approach using language more effectively in the following slides in this lecture. One of the language issues that we want to be aware of is the communication of meaning through the words that we use. Words have both denotative and connotative meanings, and the denotative meaning of a word deals with the dictionary definition. It is objective and descriptive, and it literally refers to the actual object or situation or person without any kind of value, inference, or emotional definition associated with the word. So for example, the word marriage is a denotative word that is used to refer to people who go through the institution of legal marriage in our society, and it is a fairly neutral word for a lot of people. However, the connotative meaning surrounding a word deals with the emotional or subjective meaning. It also allows us to see the type of personal meaning making that people may assign to a given issue related to the word. So the denotative meaning of marriage is fairly clear and straightforward. However, if I were to substitute marriage for a phrase such as the old ball and chain, right? Or getting hitched, or shotgun wedding, these are all different ways to refer to the process of marriage that have a more emotional or value-oriented meaning that is associating with that word. Let's explore the way that language can influence the interpretation that we have about various issues in society. In this example, I have 3 different words or references that I am using to refer to people who are homeless. We can see that the negative reference would use the word vagrant, such as there are over 2,000 vagrants in the city. By using this word vagrant, we are imparting a negative emotional salience or value to the group of people who are living with no fixed address, okay? Doing this frames the issue as if these people are a nuisance in our society. Moving on, we can use the neutral term to refer to the fact that there are over 2,000 people with no fixed address in the city. This is a literal definition, and this is a fairly value-free reference to people who have no fixed address. Turning this corner a little bit, we can move on to the positive reference, and we might say something like, there are over 2,000 homeless people in the city. By using the term homeless, it is a term that tends to evoke a more emotional response in people. And when we think about people who are homeless, we think about people in a way where they are worthy of our pity. So we can look at just this one example, and we can see how powerful language is in terms of the way that we interpret the various situation or idea that the language is referring to. There are several challenges that can emerge when we attempt to communicate through language, especially if people don't share the same orientation as we do. One thing we want to watch out for in communicating in a professional environment especially is the use of jargon or slang, which deals with group-specific words that are used between a given community. If we tend to use a lot of jargon or slang in our communication, then we run the risk of excluding people from understanding what we're talking about because they perhaps are not in with all of the lingo and may not understand what we're trying to say. So we want to try to use technical or specific language whenever possible that is explanatory, that most people can understand. In this way, we can be as inclusive as possible so that the most people possible understand what we're saying, and then we can reach people in a more effective way. This is especially so with public speeches. We want to try to use speech that is more formal or colloquial rather than jargon, slang, or pidgin, Hawaiian pidgin. Although it's a very culturally based communication form, we definitely want to try to speak in more colloquial, standard English whenever possible so that we can reach the widest amount of people. Another problem that we can run into deals with using polarizing language. Polarizing language is when we tend to use language that is either or, that may cause us or other people to perceive and talk about the world in extremes. So this has also been referred to as black and white thinking in the psychological community. So a good example of black and white thinking would be, let's say you're having a conversation with your partner or your child or someone in your family, and you're talking about an issue that tends to cause conflict in your relationship with them. And you tend to hear them saying things like, you always do this, or you never do this. Now, that's a really excellent example of polarizing language, because when you say that somebody always does something or never does something, the chances are that that is probably not correct, because very few people always or never do anything. So maybe we have used this kind of language before in our own experiences, or maybe we have heard other people using the language with us, but we definitely want to be aware of not using language that is polarizing, because what this can do is that it can cause us to view the world in extremes, and it can exacerbate communication interactions so that they do not develop in a very positive manner. Another thing that we can think about that can sometimes cause challenges in communication is the use of evasive emotional language. A euphemism is the process whereby we substitute a more pleasant word for one that is not as pleasant. So I'll never forget, I was in a classroom once in college, and it was a theater class, and so we had lots of people that were, in the class, and we would do activities in class and have to move around on stage and things like that. We would do dancing. And there was one student who tended to have more relaxed personal hygiene practices. And so I remember the professor came out, and the professor made a comment such as, "Oh, wow, it seems very odoriferous out here." And it was such a wonderful way to call out the fact that some people needed to take better care of their personal hygiene before coming to class. Because instead of using the phrase or a word such as, "Gosh, somebody smells really stinky," right? She had enough tact and she had enough class to be able to substitute a word that was less offensive for the people that perhaps were the ones that were the offending odor carriers. So in this way, language can be something that's used in a very positive manner to get our points across, but language can also be challenging, and sometimes we may be using jargon or slang, polarizing language, or evasive emotional language. And in some cases, or in many cases, using this kind of language can decrease our ability to be effective. So we want to be conscious of these words, and whenever possible, we want to craft communication messages in a way where we are being specific and concise rather than vague or using language that is polarizing or loaded with emotional tone. Another thing that we want to be conscious of is that we are always trying to use language that is considered to be politically correct. Politically correct is when we use language that shows that we respect people of different backgrounds and that we don't use language in a way that disrespects or demeans people. So, in general, we should always avoid the use of language in terms of using derogatory labels to refer to people or situations. We also want to avoid using any kind of racial slurs that we may have heard being used either in our home or among friend groups or even on the media. Just because somebody else uses derogatory labels and racial slurs does not mean that it is acceptable or appropriate for people in the modern professional environment to use them. Also, I would argue that even in your personal relationships, we should always try to avoid using derogatory labels or racial slurs, because we run the risk of alienating people and disrespecting people, which will definitely not promote effective relationships for us. In addition, I cannot emphasize enough that we should always try to avoid obscenity whenever possible. Obscenity deals with swear words or other types of really negative words that refer to different groups of people or situations. Sometimes the words are not used with any negative intention. People are just communicating the way that they always communicate. But in general, the use of derogatory labels, racial slurs, and obscenity is viewed as highly inappropriate, and we should avoid using any of these kinds of words or language whenever possible. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis suggests that the labels that we use help to shape our thinking, our worldviews, and even our behavior. Related to this is linguistic determinism, which suggests that language influences how we interpret the world. So for example, in the English language, we can use the word snow interchangeably across a variety of situations related to snow, and it's considered to be very normal. So for example, we might refer to snow that's falling, or snow that's blanketing the ground, or snow that's packed down on the road. Relatedly, in the Eskimo culture, they have languages that actually have more than 100 words just to refer to the thing called sea ice. The reason that they have so many words to refer to sea ice is because many of the Eskimos that are living in their native cultural situations and native geographical places are actually interacting very intimately with the water and with ice on a day-to-day basis in terms of their living and their hunting and survival and recreational activities and things like that. So in this way, we can see how language does influence how we interpret the world. Also, we can look at the idea of linguistic relativity, which is the belief that people who speak different languages perceive the world in different ways. It seems logical to assume that if you come from a culture that has over 100 words to refer to sea ice, that the way you would view the world would probably place much more of an emphasis and much more of a mindful awareness about the varieties of environmental situations that you might find yourself in. So we can look at this situation and we can see how language will inform the way that we view the world. We can also think about language in terms of formality and informality. So those of you who speak more than one language probably already know that across different languages, you have different terms that you need to use to refer to people based on whether they are of higher status than you or whether it's formal or informal. So in this way, we can see how the languages that we speak shape the way that we view not only communication, but also the relationships between people as well. This is always good to be aware of, especially when we are communicating with people who have a different cultural or language background than us. We should always assume that we need to be very clear about our communication, and we should always ask questions to make sure that people understand what we're saying and that we understand what they're saying. We can also paraphrase to ensure that we understand correctly the intention that people have. It's very important for us to be aware of how our culture can influence our communication style. So, for example, the Japanese culture tends to use much less direct cues and much less verbal communication than the Western culture. Western culture is much more reliant on explicit verbal communication and getting something in writing, right? Whereas in Japanese culture, we may use communication without such explicit references, but rather than directly refusing to do something for someone, we might say something like, "Oh yes, let's do that sometime," or "Yes, I can help later." This way of communication allows people to save face, and so we talked on a previous slide about high context communication versus low context communication. And so high context communication, which tends to be more traditional Japanese culture, is reliant on cues that are context specific, on cues where there's a common understanding, and more reliant on less directness. In comparison, low context cultures like the Western culture deals more with explicitly stating something. It deals more with much more divulging of personal feelings and information. And so we can see how these influences can shape the way that we approach communication, and also we can see how it may sometimes lead to misunderstandings. It's very interesting to think about the fact that cultural neuroscientists believe that the culture can actually shape our brain activity. What this means is that the cultures that we come from, the way that they view the world, and the emphasis that different values or issues have in our society can actually shape the way that our brain processes various types of activities. So, for example, a recent article in Psychology Today talked about Han and Humphrey's 2016 article, which looked at cross-cultural differences in brain activity, and they found that there are differences between East Asian and Western participants in terms of brain activity depending on the different tasks that they were working on. They found these tasks and they found the differences related to the tasks in terms of the brain activity related to things like visual perception, attention, arithmetic processing, and even self-reflection. So this does show that the culture that we come from not only shapes our language, but also can shape the way that our brain processes information. In some cultures, symbolism and vagueness is actually embedded in the language instead of explicit or direct or straight talk communication. So it's important for us to be aware of this because it helps us to understand other cultures and understand that there will be differences and that we need to keep an open mind in trying to really understand what people are trying to get at, even if we're not used to that kind of communication. The recent article that I referenced just a few moments ago can be found at the Psychology Today website, which is listed right here. If you are not able to click on it, you should be able to copy and paste it in a browser, and you should be able to look over this very interesting article. One thing that we always want to avoid when communicating with others is the use of prejudiced talk. Linguistic prejudice is when we use language that is prejudicial to refer to people of different groups or backgrounds. It may relate to people in a way that conveys a sexist attitude. We may come across as ageist or racist. We definitely want to avoid using language that is disparaging to any members of any co-culture around which we live. Unfortunately, in the modern media, we often see people who are in influential positions using terms or language to refer to various groups of people that are prejudicial. It's always very important to ask ourselves what the effect of that language is on the society in which we live, on the group of people that it's targeting, and on intercultural effective communication. Just because people in the public realm are using language that is prejudiced to refer to various groups does not make it acceptable or morally responsible. We should always avoid using prejudicial language, even if it is being used in the home in which we grew up, in our friend circles, or in the media. One of the things we always want to be aware of when communicating, especially in a public manner or professional setting, is that we use what is considered to be powerful speech. Powerful speech is a way of communicating that is clear and direct and concise, and that has the absence of several different speech markers. We're going to go through several of these markers on this slide, but generally speaking, it's good for us to be aware of the fact that people who use powerless speech markers are perceived by listeners as less credible, less competent, and less confident. So in general, especially in a public setting or a professional situation, we want to work to speak clearly and concisely with the absence of powerless speech markers, and we're going to go through some of these right now. One of the first type of speech marker that's considered powerless is the use of qualifiers. These are tentative phrases that we might throw into our statement, which basically makes it less of an impact or less of a definitive when people hear it. So you might start out a statement with, well, I think that this is correct, and then you might deliver the rest of the information. We might also hear people using tag questions. Tag questions are delivered at the end of a sentence, and they sound like this. It's a beautiful day out, isn't it? We may also hear people using things like disclaimers. Disclaimers tend to make an excuse about what they're about to say, which serves to mitigate or reduce the impact of any potential negative perception that a listener might have. So I might say something like, well, don't get me wrong, but, and then I might deliver a piece of information that somebody may not like or may disagree with, or something like that. In addition, oftentimes in public speaking classes like this, I tend to hear a lot of students using hedges or filler words when they are delivering their public speech. The use of hedges and filler words definitely reduces perceptions that people will have about your credibility and your expertise and your confidence. In general, it is very good to learn how to speak in a way where you are not using hedges and filler words such as like, or something similar to that. In general, we want to strive to learn how to speak in a way where we can speak in a powerful manner with a clear speaking voice, and we also want to think about issues related to projecting so that people in our audience are able to hear us effectively. You may find yourself in situations at work or at school or in professional environments in the future where you are asked to give a speech, but they do not provide a microphone for you. In my theatrical classes in college, we spent a lot of time learning how to project from our diaphragm when we do public speaking. This is because it's extremely important for people who are in the back of the audience to be able to hear you, as well as the people who are sitting in the front row. There is nothing more frustrating than being in a room where there's a public speech being given and not being able to hear what people are saying. We can also think about being able to speak in a clear and concise and loud enough way so that people in our family can hear us when we're sitting around a dinner table, right? Now, some of us may have picked up less than ideal communication tendencies from our environments when we were growing up, or maybe from the people that were our role models, but this is something that we can all learn how to improve upon. I don't know if you've noticed it, but in my lectures that I deliver in this course and in all of my courses, I work to speak in a very colloquial fashion, and I work to avoid the use of these powerless speech markers that we have talked about here on this slide. Certainly, being a professor for the last 15 years has really helped me to learn to be a good self-monitor. So when I do start to use hedge words, qualifiers, or other types of phrases or language that may not be that effective, I can actually hear myself doing it when it happens, and I'm able to modify and autocorrect when it happens. Now, certainly, none of us is going to be perfect with our speech. We can do the best we can. We can work to self-monitor and to improve. And then if you're doing your best, then you should feel good about that. But I do want to just let you know that you can work on becoming a more effective speaker if you do find that you use a lot of hedges or filler words. So if you do find that you want to improve on this, it is definitely something that you can work to improve, and you will have lots of benefits for doing that in terms of your personal and professional communication effectiveness. Technology also influences our language use and our communication. Online speak has been the term that's developed to refer to informal communication, either on electronic or media-dominated forums. In general, when people are online or communicating through technology such as texting or things like that, or instant messaging, they tend to use more informal communication methods. Sometimes we need to be careful because we may find that people who are in online forums may be more likely to use language or ideas that are disrespectful to certain groups of people, and in some ways there might be less concern for other people's feelings. So we don't want to be one of these people, right? Just because we have an email that we're going to send to a classmate or a professor or something like that, we always want to be conscious of the way that our message is coming across. And the thing with technology is that it allows you to communicate instantly to anybody you want. And so sometimes we need to be very careful about crafting messages that are going to be going to people where we have a past together, and we probably will have a future together in terms of a job or working at the same organization or community organization or community function. So we always want to be careful not to respond to a message that is upsetting instantly. It's always good to definitely wait until the next day or two. And also, I strongly suggest that before you send a message that contains negative information to somebody, that you try sending it to yourself first, and then waiting a day or two and looking at it and asking yourself, okay, how would I receive this message if I were the person that had to open it in my inbox? Another thing that I always like to mention with students is that we need to be very conscious of the ways that our technological profiles influence perceptions of professionalism in the modern community. So most of you probably have accounts related to Facebook or Snapchat or other types of online media connecting forums. It's extremely important for you folks to always think about the way that you would be perceived by potential employers or potential people that might give you an internship or people that might even be accepting you into graduate school. One of the first things that employers do nowadays when they get an application is they go and they look for information about the person that they can find online. So what this means is that any of your public websites should have photos of you and information and language being used that is responsible and professional. I strongly advise you to integrate this idea into your media activities so that you don't inhibit or sabotage yourself from getting a very good professional opportunity because you just didn't think that that possible employer was actually going to go look at your Facebook page. This is definitely something we want to be aware of. Also related to technology is the use of emoticons and the way that different types of emoticons can be perceived on the receiving end, right? So in general, electronic communication has radically transformed the way that we relate to people. In some ways, having all of this technology is a benefit, right? Because it helps us perhaps to connect with people that live in places that are far away, or it helps us to stay close to people that we are family or friends with that maybe have moved away, right? And we can use technology to do that through Skype or cell phones or texting. However, technology has also been evaluated by many scholars as something that actually tends to be more of an isolating factor in our modern society. So we want to make sure that we don't give technology so much of a foothold in our life that we are not developing the correct amount and closeness in our human-to-human relationships. In general, we should always put our relationships above technology. So it's very important to be conscious of this. We can ask ourselves, how much are we using technology on our day-to-day basis? Are we ever giving up time with family or friends or people that we want to spend time with, or even doing activities that we want to be doing more of because of technology in our life? How is technology influencing us for good or for possibly for bad? Do we find that when we surf the web every morning and look at all the newspapers that we tend to have a more negative view of the world because the newspapers report negative information more than positive? What is the impact of those television shows that you watch on a daily basis? Or what is the impact of your cell phone on the relationships that you have and on your ability to communicate interpersonally with other people? These are all things that we want to consider as we continue to work with technology in our day-to-day lives. So in conclusion, this chapter has allowed us to look at language and how language and labels affect our behavior. We have also analyzed the way that words can affect the feelings that we have, the attitudes that we share, and the meaning making that we create in our communication interactions with others. We've also looked at how identity or the experiences that we've had can shape how we view certain words. This is important to keep in mind as we go about our daily lives with an understanding that meanings are in people, not in words. What this means is that when we are communicating with people, we want to ask follow-up questions and paraphrase for them when we're listening so that we can determine if we are creating shared meaning. We want to avoid miscommunications whenever possible, and listening carefully, asking questions, and paraphrasing can really affect our ability to make sure that the meanings that we are creating are shared. As I mentioned before, we should always strive to communicate with others and about others through using non-biased or prejudicial language. Finally, we talked about the importance of communicating through clear and concise language by using powerful speech whenever possible, especially when we're in a professional or a public setting. We want to strive to use powerful speech rather than powerless speech markers because when we speak in a powerless fashion, it causes our listeners to perceive us as less confident, competent, and credible. These are all things that we can work on by becoming more self-reflexive or becoming more aware in terms of our self-monitoring skills. So I encourage you all to think about where you lie on all of these different issues and try to identify a few areas that you would like to work on improving in your day-to-day interactions and during your public speeches. Thank you very much for your time in this chapter. This has been a great chapter for all of us to look at, and I appreciate the attention that you're giving to learning how to be an effective and responsible communicator. I'll talk to you all in the next chapter. Thank you.